Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield such time as he may consume to Mr. Pence, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Middle East and South Asia, whose Minority Staff Director, Greg McCarthy, setting up the posters, is an Iraq War veteran and a Marine as well. Thank you.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank the ranking member for yielding time, and I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to the concurrent resolution for the House. And I do so from a position of a humble public servant, one who has not served in Iraq in uniform as our previous speaker did, and others have who are in this chamber at my side, but as one who has been there. And I rise as one who is charged with public responsibilities, as the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee. While this resolution before the Congress today and this week, while this resolution expresses support for our troops in Iraq, the heart of the resolution is a statement of disapproval of the President's so-called surge of troops in Iraq, and I cannot support it. I see Iraq, as others have eloquently stated, as the central front in the war on terror. And I rise today in opposition to this resolution out of a fundamental sense that we have a moral obligation to finish what we started, to confront the enemies of our way of life, and to support our duly elected Commander-in-Chief as he makes those decisions that he deems necessary and appropriate to achieve those ends. Now let me say from the heart for a moment my reasons for supporting this troop surge. A few days before President Bush addressed the nation, he invited a handful of members of Congress down to the West Wing of the White House. And I must tell you, Mr. Speaker, that I had my doubts about this troop surge. In all 4 of my trips to Iraq, I had heard consistently from our military commanders over the past several years that a large American footprint in Iraq was actually counterproductive to our goals. But August and its aftermath of 2006 changed all of that. All of that advice predated an extraordinary increase in violence that commenced in the late summer of last year, when it became clear to all of us in this body and to freedom-loving people around the world that our strategy and tactics on the ground in Iraq was not working. Now, I took that skepticism and that counsel in to the cabinet room of the West Wing, and there I heard the President describe a new strategy and new tactics. For all the world to have read the newspaper accounts, Mr. Speaker, I would have assumed the President was simply sending more troops for more troops' sake. But that was not the case. Despite what the previous speaker on this floor suggested, this is a new strategy. It is a new way forward. It is an effort on the part of the President to embrace an increase in troop strength in Baghdad that was initially recommended by the Iraq Study Group. And more on that in a moment. But let me say that I believe this new way forward, this new approach, ought to be given a chance to work. I believe to oppose the President's new strategy in Iraq is to accept the status quo. And the headlines of the last 24 hours should tell every man and woman of goodwill in this Congress that the status quo in Iraq is not acceptable. Now, earlier I mentioned that the approach of a troop surge in Baghdad was first recommended by the Iraq Study Group. I am quite struck, Mr. Speaker, that the previous speaker, who's a freshman member of Congress from Pennsylvania, spoke, as many have in the Democrat majority, quite glowingly of the report of the Iraq Study Group. And I admire this work product greatly. A bipartisan work authorized during the last Congress, James A. Baker III, former Secretary of State, Lee Hamilton of Indiana, a former chairman of the House International Relations Committee, bringing together a bipartisan group of wise counselors, developed the Iraq Study Group report. And while I don't agree with every aspect of it, particularly those that talk about it, about having a dialogue with terrorist states in the region, there is much that recommends the American people to the Iraq Study Group. And again, I cite in evidence the gentleman from Pennsylvania's glowing reference to that report just moments ago. Now let's look, if we can, at what the Iraq Study Group has to say about the idea of a troop surge in Iraq. I would offer very humbly, and maybe startling to some who are looking in, Mr. Speaker, that the very word troop surge comes from the Iraq Study Group's recommendations. Allow me to quote from page 73 of the book that's available in bookstores all over America. The Iraq Study Group said, and I quote, "We could, however, support a short-term redeployment or surge of American combat forces to stabilize Baghdad, or to speed up the training and equipping mission if the U.S. commander in Iraq determines that such steps would be effective." Let me emphasize that again. The Iraq Study Group that the gentleman from Pennsylvania and many in the majority have heralded as an important work that provides us with a vision for going forward, says we could, however, support a short-term redeployment or surge of American combat forces to stabilize Baghdad. Mr. Speaker, that's precisely what President Bush called for in January.